It's a great pleasure for me to introduce the first speaker, Professor Krista Fischer from the University of Tartu, Estonia. And Krista will introduce to us this session starting from the title, Asking and Answering Causal Questions with the Help of Statistics and Genetics, Basic Concepts and Methods. Krista, welcome.
Hello, and welcome you all to this session. And thanks the organizer for inviting me here. Well, I'm trying to give you some basic introduction to causal inference. So I'm getting to Mendelian randomization towards the end of my talk, but starting with some general questions about causality. I hope it's useful to at least some of you. So I have no other conflicts to declare, just research grants. And yes, we go today from definition of causal effect to some examples of causal inference that people are doing. Also briefly about target trial emulation, and then getting to Mendelian randomization ideas. So we all know that association and correlation is not the same as causation. You're probably familiar with this nice graph that was published in New England Journal of Medicine in 2012, showing a very strong correlation between chocolate consumption per capita and the number of Nobel Prizes per capita per country. As you see, Sweden is an outlier there because they are the ones issuing the Nobel Prizes, so they get some more than chocolate consumption would allow. So, yeah, it's a nice plot, but we all know that you can eat as much chocolate as you want. That it's by itself doesn't bring you closer to a Nobel Prize. There are other factors for that. So let's look at another plot from the Estonian Biobank. It's a plot of cumulative mortality in women 50 plus in the Estonian Biobank cohort. And you see the two lines corresponds to women who drink coffee and who do not drink coffee. The difference between these two lines is extremely high, so you see, big. You see that the 15-year mortality is something like 25% for coffee drinkers and close to 40% for non-drinkers. So it's arises a question, is the effect of coffee drinking so huge? Being in Italy, we like the good espressos here, but does it help so much? Well, we have forgotten here one simple thing, that if you are a woman 50 plus, you can still have a very different age. So if we use age as time scale, we see a bit different plot, but still you see difference between the two lines. So you can still ask, does actually coffee drinking prolong life, or do coffee drinkers live longer for various reasons? Here I borrow a plot from the book Causal Inference, What If by Miguel Hernan and Jamie Robbins. You can find this book online, and I strongly recommend it because it gives a very nice introduction to causal inference. So what we see here, there is a population of interest and some people are untreated, some treated, like treated drinking coffee, untreated don't drink coffee. And yes, if we are looking at statistical association, we are actually comparing mortality in one subset of the population with the mortality in the other subset of the population, like in coffee drinkers and non-drinkers. But actually, if we want to ask a causal question, we would be interested in what would be the mortality in a parallel universe that would be exactly the same as ours, with the exception that no one drinks coffee. Coffee doesn't exist in this world. And in another parallel universe where everyone drinks coffee, when we would be forced to drink coffee, whether we want or not. So, of course, if everything else is the same, difference between mortality in these two parallel universes would tell us what is the causal effect of drinking coffee. So, yes, association is not causation, but yes, can sometimes it still be. So we have the hypothetical causal effects, because we don't have data about parallel universes, we don't measure this causal effect directly. And why comparing just these subsets of population would not give us the answer? We know it is because of confounding. There are factors that influence both the exposure, so the fact that you decide to drink coffee, and the outcome, mortality, and your health risks. So coffee drinkers and non-drinkers can differ in many other ways. For instance, if you have an underlying disease and the doctor tells you that it's not recommended to drink coffee, if you're taking this medication, you're not drinking. And we can use a DAG, a directly acyclic graph, to describe this confounded association. And then we know that if there is no confounding, if we can believe that actually these two subsets of the population are random subsets of the population, then we can actually compare the averages in these two groups and estimate the causal effect. It can be sometimes realistic if we are speaking about the causal effect of some genetic factors in some very homogeneous population. But even there you have to be cautious, of course. So how to define causal effects in a way that enables us to define causal models? We also follow the notation by Hernan and Robbins' book. We can define Y with a superscript A as a potential outcome following an exposure A. So if A is binary, then Y with superscript 1 is a potential outcome in case of exposure, so in potential mortality if you drink coffee, and Y with superscript 0 as a potential exposure-free outcome. We call these outcomes as counterfactual because they are never jointly observed in the same individual. So we can define the individual causal effect as a difference between these two, but we can't measure it. Population average causal effect would be average over the population, and sometimes one also is interested in average treatment effect in the treated or average treatment causal effect in the exposed. So we are only interested how much coffee drinking does either harm or benefit individuals, for instance. But yes, we cannot estimate this average effect either unless we are willing to make some assumptions. So one assumption would be exchangeability. That is actually the same assumption as saying that there are no confounders at all. So it means indeed that exposed and unexposed are just two random subsets of the populations regarding the outcome, and so we can just compare the averages. So mathematically we can write that if we take an expectation of Y in the subset where A has a certain value, that would be same as the expectation of the potential outcome in the population. And yes, that means that Y, the potential outcomes are independent of the actual exposure. So coffee example would say that exchangeability would mean that individual's choice is independent of the potential mortality individual and the risk factors thereof. So yes, if we can work out also with formulas that indeed with exchangeability we can estimate the causal effect. And actually exchangeability is guaranteed in an ideal randomized trial where we assign just randomly the treatment group to treatment, so we give them treatment, they all receive that treatment, and the control group gets a placebo, for instance. And there are indeed, if we look at the average, so the average potential treatment outcome in the treated group, because treated group is a random subset of the population, so that would be actually the average potential outcome also in the population, and in untreated group we will observe the potential treatment-free outcome, and yes, we can estimate the effect. So exchangeability means there is no confounding. Well, often there is confounding, but in some cases we can believe that we have the data on all confounders. Then we can say that we have conditional exchangeability. So the assumption of conditional exchangeability is satisfied when the outcome and the treatment are independent given some set of covariates, L, for instance. So basically we can say that average expected outcome, if we know the values of covariates, and the treatment is actually as expected potential outcome given the same treatment level, and this is independent of the actual treatment, so we are able to estimate the average potential outcome in a certain subset of population defined by the covariate L. For instance, with the coffee drinking examples, that coffee drinkers and non-drinkers may have different underlying risk level, but if we believe that we have all the relevant factors like smoking, obesity, sugar consumption, maybe prevalent diseases, and so on, and so if we look at individuals who are similar with respect to these variables and just some drink coffee and some not, we can think it's kind of random assignments, or it's quite random why someone drinks coffee or not within this subset. So yes, we can look at the DAG, so with conditional exchangeability. So L is a set of confounders. We know it affects both A and Y, and we have measured it. So we can estimate stratum-specific causal effects in this case, just causal effects or just the average outcomes in the relevant subsets. Well, if we want to estimate average causal effects, the population average causal effect under conditional exchangeability, there are some methods that enable us to do that, because if we get stratum-specific causal effects, we have to combine these to get the overall causal effect. So first method is called inverse probability weighting, so we kind of apply a weight to each observation. The weight is inverse of the probability of getting the treatments that you're actually getting. So these weights create a kind of pseudo-population where we have a perfect balance of all confounders in treated and untreated individuals, so we get the pseudo-population where actually the unconditional exchangeability holds, and so then we can derive the estimates from there. Standardization, I find even a bit simpler method. It's like adjusting for all relevant confounders. We just fit the regression model, adjust for all confounders that we have, but then we get average predicted values for the entire cohort, for instance, by setting the treatment equal to 1, for instance. We, like in case everyone were a coffee drinker, and then 0, and then we get 2 sets of predicted values, and from there we can work out different population, different versions of average causal effect estimates. We did this exercise with a bachelor student of mine, Laura Himma, and here you see again a coffee drinking example, but a bit differently presented. So it's a 10-year mortality in individuals who were 50 to 69-year-old in the Estonian Biobank. So you see the crude difference in 10-year mortality is quite huge. It's like 1/3 the difference. So the coffee non-drinkers have clearly higher mortality than coffee drinkers. Using this inverse probability weighting and standardization, we used 14 different variables that appear to be associated with coffee drinking. We see the difference reduced quite a lot, especially with standardization. We see that the average estimated mortality in the entire cohort, if everyone were a coffee drinker, is a bit higher than what we see in coffee drinkers in fact, but the estimated mortality in coffee non-drinkers in the entire cohort becomes much smaller than it is in the subset. So the difference still actually remains statistically significant very clearly, so we don't know actually whether some causal effect is actually present or we have missed some important confounders here, but it's still a good exercise to see how it changes if we use the methods. Sometimes you may also ask, why do we use these tricks, this inverse probability weighting and standardization? Why to complicate things if we could just use simple regression adjustment? Well, we can if the model is just a classical linear regression model, but if the model is logistic regression or we have interactions, then it becomes more complicated, and it's really recommended to use these kinds of methods. So speaking about confounders, I also have to mention colliders. Both have been mentioned several times in the talks of this conference. So collider, if we have a graph with colliders, and you see the arrows goes the other way around. We have exposure and the outcome, and actually both are having an effect on a third variable z. So you see like the paths from A and Y collide at z, so z is called collider. Collider is not a confounder. It becomes a confounder if you are adjusting for it. So why it is, why so? I like to do the example, bring the example of like children and parents, that if you know of someone that he or she is a parent of a child, you wouldn't have any idea how would the other parent look like. But if you see a parent with a child, then looking at their phenotypes, so to say, hair color, eye color, and so you can guess something about the phenotype of the other parent, because if the child has like dark hair and dark eyes, and one parent has blonde and blue eyes, then you can think that, okay, the other parent must have dark hair. At least in some cases it works. So knowing both, seeing both A and Z would give you some information about why, even if the causal effect is not present. And you can also work it out mathematically. So you should not adjust the analysis for Z. If you do adjust, then you will get the biased estimate, because you create an association between Y and A as well. But actually collider bias can occur quite often in biobanks, because one common example of collider bias is a selection effect. And I borrow one example that was related to COVID, actually. In this paper, they also used this graph, where on x-axis you have academic ability and y-axis sporting ability. And if you are interested in the correlation between the two, but your sample, the red dots, come from a top-ranked university. To get admitted to this university, there are two options. Either you are outstanding academically, or maybe you are not that outstanding academically, but you are a very top-level athlete. So if you find a student who is academically not very good, then you already know that he or she must be very good at sports. So you see in this selective sample, you see a negative association, whereas in population, there is probably no association at all. So, and now if you're thinking about biobanks, if there are different factors influencing the recruitment to the biobank, like Estonian biobank is also volunteer-based, so why do some people choose to join the biobank and some not? And if you can think of two such factors, like in Estonia we would have like education and gender, we know that analyzing the association between these two variables in the biobank cohort would actually induce, will show an association that might not be true in the population. Actually, Estonian biobank has two a bit different cohorts, like 50,000 recruited before 2018 and 150,000 afterwards. And we also see that, for instance, if we look at the effect of smoking on all-cause mortality, either adjusted for sex or not, if we pool the data together, assume it's one cohort, we see a bit stronger effect than we would see either if we adjust for cohort, or even if we analyze the two cohorts separately. So these are things that strange things that you can happen if you ignore this differential selection. And here we have a polygenic score for educational attainment, and the blue also educational attainment itself. So we also see different things going on in the two cohorts and different precision of the estimates. So one has to be aware of that. Well, but now moving away from colliders, so how can we apply these causal inference techniques I mentioned before in a cohort study like in biobanks? There is one idea is target trial emulation. Yesterday there was also a talk by Jakob German from FIM on with examples on target trial emulation. So what is that? Randomized controlled trials are considered, we know, gold standard. Why? I told you why. And with target trial emulation, we try to use observational data so that we actually emulate the randomized trial without actually, in fact, conducting one. So it would save a lot of money, actually, and given that we have large cohorts linked with electronic health records available, why not doing it? Well, what do we need? We need to be carefully formulate the causal question of interest, and then we could specify a theoretical trials that we would like to conduct, and then we should align the data so that it emulates the target trial. Of course, but there actually the assumption of no unmeasured confounders is also crucial. So the coffee example was not that because we didn't pay attention to initiation of the treatment. People have been drinking coffee all their lives. So what do we need to do? So my PhD student Saskia Kuusk is working on that, so it's her slide. So the protocol needs to be written up, so that includes eligibility criteria, treatment strategies, assignment procedures, follow-up outcomes, causal contrast of interest, analysis plans. So everything that you would have with a common RCT. But a common error that leads to biased estimates if we misalign the start of follow-up time, treatment assignment, and eligibility criteria. If we have a real randomized trial, then we do all these three things usually occur at the same time. But with observational data, it's often impossible to have them three in the same time. So what happens if we do not get it right? So for instance, so if we at some time point our records the covariates where we validate the inclusion-exclusion criteria, then we kind of emulate the recruitment period, and then from some point on we start the follow-up. We get the kind of prevalent user bias because people already can start treatment before start of follow-up, and maybe if you have a serious side effect of treatment or something, they can drop out before, so we may have a selective sample here. We may have, so if we move the validation past the start of the treatment, then we get the post-treatment selection bias because already the variables we want to measure would be changed. So if we move the validation, we start follow-up, and then actually the treatment would be started, and then we check the inclusion criteria. Then we get kind of immortal time bias because we do not allow the outcome to occur within this period. And immortal time bias, so a good example of immortal time bias was brought, it was the example of why Oscar winning actors live longer than others. And yes, does winning an Oscar have a causal effect on mortality? Actually, just it's the other way around, that people who live long enough to receive an Oscar can receive Oscar. So yes, one has to be careful with that, and it's quite tricky. So we try to do this using the example of a cholesterol-lowering treatment and its effect on on CVD, cardiovascular disease prevention, because in Estonia, statins are not so prescribed as often as they should be. So yeah, we wrote down a protocol, eligibility criteria, treatment strategies, and so yeah, we defined that in treatment group, people were people who received prescription within 1 year after a high cholesterol level recording, and non-initiators did not receive prescription within 1 year, so that was the control group. And so, yes, and there were a lot of baseline covariates we used. And so follow-up started at the high cholesterol measurement and ended at death, loss to follow-up, or outcome occurrence. So we had 3 different outcomes of varying severity to consider, and we were interested in intention to treat effect. So the initial results were very optimistic. At least for one of the 3 outcomes, the effect apparently became very strong, so it looks like the getting statins like halves your risk of myocardial infarction. Well, also it's nice, it's a bit too optimistic. If you know about statins, they reduce your risk, but maybe not 2 times. So we did a careful reanalysis, so the 1 year period was shortened to 1 month and so on, and adjusted for additional confounders, and what happens, actually the effect disappeared and became completely non-significant. So that was a good lesson to us that really you have to be careful. So target trial emulation in biobanks, is it mission impossible? I think it definitely has some potential, but as I said, that as treatment decisions in real life are not random, so we may not be able to identify all relevant confounders, and how to get rid of the immortal time bias and the prevalent user bias is another big question. But not now, let's look at the problem when we have unmeasured confounding. Sometimes we cannot really identify the causal effect in this case, but sometimes the data structure provides some solutions. One example is instrumental variables estimation. And the most common application in biobanks is Mendelian randomization. So before going to Mendelian randomization, let's look again at the randomized controlled trial, RCT, but now assume it's not an ideal one. So you may have, random assignment has an effect on exposure, but some people may not take their pills correctly. But still there is an association. And yes, we ask what is the causal effect of exposure and outcome. And there are confounders, because if some people don't take their pills correctly, it can be related to the outcome. Maybe they don't feel ill enough to take the treatment, or maybe they just experience some side effects. So several things can be going on. So if we look at the potential equations that we may write based on this graph, we see that, okay, y depends on x and confounders, x depends on r and confounders. So y and x would be correlated because of confounding, because they have a common term in the equations, but r and y can be only associated when there is a causal effect present, because r only enters via x, because r is a component of x. So indeed, a correlation between r and y can only arise when there is an association between exposure and outcome. So we can tell that randomization is an instrument that enables testing for a causal effect between exposure and outcome. And basically that means that the systematic difference between randomized groups can only occur when there is a causal effect of exposure. So this actually explains why intention to treat analysis would work. Well, but when we have, looking at this scheme, we can think that, okay, what if we see something similar without having to conduct a randomized controlled trial? And that is where the idea of Mendelian randomization, first, I think, proposed by George Davis Smith, was proposed. So there is a genotype that can actually act like a randomization. It has an effect if we have reasons to believe that this genotype variable or a genetic score even only has an effect on X, on the exposure, we see exactly the same picture. So if we test the association between G and Y, we test for the presence of the causal effect. So going through it again, so we have asked the question whether exposure has an effect on the outcome. We know that this association is confounded. We have some genetic variables to predict the outcome. And now it's important part. We have to be sure that there is no direct effect of the genetic variable on the outcome. And we also have to be sure that there is no effect of the genetic variable on the confounders here. If we have good reasons to believe that it's like that, then we can actually use the idea of Mendelian randomization. So because in this case, the statistical association between exposure and outcome is only possible when there is a causal effect. So we can also show how does it work mathematically and how we can actually estimate the effect size. So if we look at if we fit a regression model for X with G as a covariate, we estimate the parameter here. So if it's a linear regression, so we have a simple linear regression model here. If we fit a regression model for Y with G as the only covariate, we get also a coefficient here, but that coefficient would be a product of the coefficient between G and X and actually the causal parameter of interest. So here we get the product of the two, because it is just this path that leads from G to Y, and you can work out it mathematically that the coefficients that we get from this regression will be the product of the two. So that means that if we have identified the product and if we have identified one component of the product, we can identify the other component by just dividing the two coefficients. This estimate is called as a Wald ratio, and yes, there are ways to work out the standard error of the estimate as well. And the technique in general is called as instrumental variables IV estimation, where G, now the genetic variant, is an instrument. But of course, we have to believe there is no direct effect of G on Y and on confounders. A famous example is already by Michael Holmes and others in British BMJ from 2014, looking at the association between ADH1B gene and coronary heart disease, as this gene is known to be associated with alcohol metabolism. And so some people, like LLA carriers, I think, they are not able to metabolize alcohol, so they would just feel some kind of toxic effects from alcohol disease and so on. And so, maybe it's the other way around. And if we look at the odds ratio, coronary artery disease associated with this gene, we see a clear association, and if we know that this gene does not have any direct effect on the disease, but only can affect alcohol metabolism, we can derive from their causal effect estimate on for the effect of alcohol on heart disease. And now later, I think, maybe 5 years later, there was a big study using Asian biobanks, because this variant is more common in Asia, showing a clear dose-response relationship between alcohol and heart disease, bringing some bad news to all of us who believed that a glass of wine every now and then would be actually beneficial. This study showed that there is still a linear dose-response association, more or less, that even some alcohol is not really good. Maybe we can just believe that if the amount is not too big, then we are still relatively safe. But in general, if we cannot exclude the direct effect of G on Y, or even indirect via some other variables, we can say that there is a pleiotropy. G has a pleiotropic effect. It has an effect on X, it has an effect on Y, and we know that the MR, Mendelian randomization assumption, the basic assumption, is violated. Well, we can still work out what happens if we ignore this, and we still go on and estimate. You see that if we derive what is expected value of Y given G, there are like two pathways. One that I showed you before, it's a product of the two coefficients, and then there is a third coefficient, the direct effect coefficient. So you actually see that if we use IV method, we calculate the ratio, we get what we estimate is a causal parameter plus a ratio of two betas, that is an association between G and X, and the direct association between G and Y. So we know that the estimate will be biased, and we know what the bias is. Well, some people can we actually test for pleiotropy? A naive approach would be to fit a linear regression model for Y, so why don't we fit a regression model for Y using X and G both as covariates? If you look at this graph, this tag carefully, you see that in this case X would become a collider in case of confounding, because you see an arrow from U coming to X and arrow from G to X. So we will get, even if there is no causal effect, we will get some strange results here. So we cannot actually test for pleiotropy. If underlying biology would tell us that there is no pleiotropy, that would be good. Otherwise, it's difficult. Well, but using the fact that we know what the bias is, so some people like Jack Bowden and also Stephen Porges, who will be speaking next, derived a method that is called as the Egger method for Mendelian randomization, thinking that, okay, if you have different genetic variants, then this bias will be different for each variant, because it's just the associations that we would see in GWAS. And if we plot these associations and fit the regression model, we can derive the causal effect from there. Well, it looks like a nice solution, but one has to be aware that this is not assumption-free, and it lacks power, and it's proposed more like a sensitivity analysis approach. So one has to be careful here as well, and I hope Stephen will talk more about different things that you can do with Mendelian randomization. So, and to summarize my talk, I would say that, yeah, we all know association is not causation, but sometimes people tend to give causal interpretation to observational associations. If we see that people who drink coffee live longer, we really want at least the people like myself who likes to drink coffee, we like to believe that, okay, probably maybe there is some causality still, but one has to be careful. So if we can assume that all relevant confounders are measured, we can use different tricks to derive the causal effects of interest. I would encourage to use these things more in biobank data as well, involving genetics. And even sometimes conventional regression adjustment would do good, but one has to be aware of colliders, and especially selection effects can be really tricky. And it was, for instance, the same COVID example, Sarse showed that because of selection effects, there was an initial finding that smokers are kind of protected from serious COVID. But actually, it came for the fact that young smokers, like young policemen and other healthcare workers, were tested who mostly didn't have COVID, and then old risk group individuals who mostly were not smokers, they were tested, and the association appeared. So, yes, if we have actually unmeasured confounders, we cannot exclude their possibility. We can use sometimes instrumental variables methods like Mendelian randomization, but of course they rely on untestable assumptions. And yeah, a lot of work has been done in recent decades, or decade mostly, to improve the MR estimates, to kind of find a workaround in case of some violations of assumptions. There are a lot of interesting papers around, but they still can't do miracles if the data is messy, and we really still always have some untestable assumptions left that we have to believe in. So yes, and I would also thank my PhD students who have been working on causal inference and provided some examples in this talk. Thanks you all, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Krista. We indeed have time for questions. Are there any questions from the audience? Don't hesitate. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you for your talk. Christian Riccio from Davos, Switzerland. You showed a slide with this target...
target trial emulation.
Yes, and there was a hazard ratio below 1 for cardiovascular events, I think, but for mortality, it was higher when you took statins. So does it mean that statins reduce cardiovascular disease but increase mortality?
It's very difficult to interpret because that analysis was not really done correctly. But yeah, now when we reanalyze the data, try to do everything correctly, we even got, I think, 2 effects out of 3 became to be above 1. But we still think that there is this kind of bias present that doctors do not prescribe statins randomly, even if they do not prescribe statins to everyone, but they still prescribe if they believe that this individual is at a higher risk. And we might not have all relevant variables that would describes that properly. So I would guess that there are just more high-risk people getting statins because there have been large randomized trials showing clearly that there is an effect of statins and it's not increasing mortality. But of course, it's interesting. We are also continuing with our attempts to get closer to the true causal effect there.
And with the higher mortality but less cardiovascular, are you able to tell what the reasons of death are for the statin group? If it's related to something, is it cancer or something?
Well, we analyzed the outcome was cardiovascular mortality, so it was cardiovascular death. Yeah, but it wasn't that was non-significant, and even after reanalysis, we didn't get significant harmful effects out. So it's very you shouldn't actually interpret statistically non-significant effects. It's just random variation in the data as well.
Thank you.
So you mentioned the collider bias. So I think there's no way you can really undo, there's no way you can avoid the collider if it's already in your data, right? But is there any way you can compensate for it in the analysis?
Actually, if you have selection bias and if you have some data on what are the variables in, like, say, given the Estonian Biobank example, if we know, and education is one of the factors affecting the decision to join the biobank and not, and we know what is the distribution of education levels in the population, we get it from census data, and we have it in biobank, so we can use some clever weights if with some data to at least to some extent to correct for it. So actually, there are ways to get rid or at least reduce the selection bias.
Brilliant, thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay. Oh, yeah, wonderful.
So we have a particular case in a study actually we are performing, and actually we have the chance to measure directly the effects of the exposure on the outcome. But then we do the Mendelian randomization, and the effect that we measure there has the opposite sign. How can we explain this?
It can happen, even if the assumptions of Mendelian randomization are satisfied. You can think of some confounders that first create a crude association. Maybe there is even if there is no causal effect, you can see association in case of confounders. And sometimes you can see associations that has a different directions, and actually the true association would be. So it is possible, and Mendelian randomization, even if all assumptions are satisfied, it can reveal then the true association. But of course, one has to be careful. Maybe there is still some pleiotropy going on, but it's not impossible that the true causal effect is opposite to what you're actually seeing in the data. So
you're suggesting we have to trust the Mendelian randomization more than a direct measurement?
I would definitely, maybe Stephen can later also comment that, but I would say that yes, if you just look at the crude association, then compared to that, Mendelian randomization can be more trustworthy. But I would also, besides of the crude association, you can also try to think of what confounders do you have, and can you take them into account in the analysis to also first to improve it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Krista. I think we are done now with questions. Thank you again.